All right, guys. Tonight, our topic that we're looking at is Jamestown, the first English colony. Sort of. The reason why it's sort of the first English colony is because there was a group of people who came over from England before it and tried to settle in North Carolina in what we call the Roanoke colony or the Lost colony. And that kind of gives you a reason why it's not considered the first, is because it failed and it disappeared. So Jamestown we consider to be the first permanent colony in America, and it was established in 1607 when King James I of England gave a group called the Virginia Company a charter that allowed them the right to recruit settlers and set up a colony in Virginia. People could invest their money in this company, and so these investors owned stock in the Virginia Company, and as investors, they were part owners. They had a stock in the success of the company. And if the company was successful, their stock value grew, and they made money off of any earnings that this Virginia Company had as a result of the settlement at Jamestown. So in 1607, a small group of settlers worked their way over from England to what is today North America. And right from the outset, they encounter some problems. Most of these problems were entirely unexpected. The first problem they ran into was that the voyage itself took way longer than they anticipated. And as a result, they used up more supplies than they were planning. So they came in already short of supplies. And not knowing the climate and the weather of where they were going to, they just had really bad luck, and they arrived in the middle of a bad drought. So there's really nothing they could do about it. They weren't aware of this fact. And so when you're moving to a new place and you're settling down on the first time and you get there and you're in the middle of a drought, you're already running into some major issues with water and being able to grow enough food. In addition to that, the location that they picked really just wasn't that great. They kind of settled in the middle of a swamp. So you can think of a swamp with lots of mosquitoes, really boggy, marshy territory, tough to traverse and move through. And in addition, the water was brackish, meaning it was kind of a mix of fresh water and salt water. So they didn't really have a fresh water supply that they could use to grow crops or even drink from consistently. And then one of the other problems is as they arrived, they came into contact with natives, and almost immediately disease spread from settlers to natives and from natives to settlers. And as a result, only about 40 out of the 104 settlers or colonists who came on that first voyage survived the first year. And we're going to look at some other problems that were going on in Jamestown, starting with the settlers themselves. If you remember when you guys were thinking about investing in the Virginia Company, one of the pitches that, or one of the reasons why you might wanted to invest in the Virginia Company was that you could find gold. Well, I hope you know by now that there's no gold in Virginia, or really not a lot, not enough to make it worthwhile. And so many of the settlers who came on that pitch. They thought they were coming to find gold. And they were more interested in finding gold than they were in growing food. They were hoping to get rich quick. But turns out you can't do that in Virginia. There was no gold. And so they spent all this time looking and trying to find gold when really they needed to be spending some more time growing food. And because they came over looking for gold, these are people motivated and skilled in finding gold. They didn't really have the skills necessary to establish a sustainable colony. So they weren't people who came over looking to establish a farm that they could use to support their community. And because of the motivations of some of the men, they didn't want to work. The leaders of the party were gentlemen, all right? These are upper class. They're part of the aristocracy in England, and they're not used to working, and were generally poor leaders of the other men who were on the trip. And many of the people who came as workers were servants. These are indentured servants, so they basically have given up some of their freedoms to come over on this trip, and they didn't really have the motivation to work hard because they're not sharing in the profits of the Virginia Company. They're not motivated in the colony to be successful. They just are coming over as part of their servitude. Besides just problems within the group of settlers, they also ran into problems with Native Americans. What they didn't realize is where they settled was part of the Powhatan Kingdom or Confederacy. These local Native American groups were really well organized and were not particularly interested in these settlers. They didn't like the fact that they'd come over. Originally, some trading took place between the two groups. That's where we see some of the disease spreading from one group to the other and back and forth. But within 2 years, the natives and the settlers were at war. So the natives would stage raids and sneak into the English colony and attack. In return, the colonists staged their own surprise raids, and they tricked the natives by sending them some poisoned wine. They pretended that they were sending them this gift of wine as kind of like a peace offering. In reality, the wine was poison. So these two groups already are off very early on, onto the wrong foot if they're going to cooperate with each other. So with all these problems, let's look at some of the outcomes. So the Jamestown settlement, in the first 6 months, about half of the colonists died. So if you're one of those people who went on this voyage, you had a 50% survival rate, about. Not the best odds. A fire broke out in the middle of the colony in 1608, and that destroyed most of the buildings and a lot of the supplies. By the time the winter of 1609-1610 comes around, they're just short of food, all right? This is called the starving time this winter, when many of the colonists died as a result of starvation. So only about 60 colonists who survived that winter. However, there were some successes, and that success came in the form of tobacco. The colonists were able to make money. Remember, that's the whole point of this colony. The Virginia Company wanted to make money for its stockholders, for its investors. They were able to make money growing tobacco. The thing with tobacco is it requires a lot of land to grow it. So the settlers at Jamestown were able to survive on growing this crop. But to continue to grow this crop and make more money, they had to use more land. And as they're taking more and more land, they're going to come into greater conflicts with the natives, and that's something we're going to go into in a little bit more detail later. All right. So for your response question, what I want you to think about, if you could stand on the docks there in London or wherever these settlers took off from in 1607 and give them some advice, all right, some suggestions about how you can help them be successful. What suggestion would you give to the early settlers at Jamestown that might help them be more successful? When you think about the problems that they ran into and the outcomes that resulted of it, what advice would you give them? Be as specific as possible. And when you finish filling in these notes and answering that response question, be sure to print off your notes and bring it into class tomorrow.